I wanted to actually play you something, Brian. It's from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He had this to say, and it's an interesting video because it talks about the different way that, let's say, Ursula von der Leyen was talking about Russia in 2023 versus how Mark Rutte is talking about Russia in 2025. And it kind of underscores this paradox of, um, Russia's rise in its strength during this Ukraine conflict building, while at the same time, there's this narrative that they've tried to construct about Russia being very weak and desperate. Here we go.
Russia's financial sector is on life support. We have cut off 3/4 of Russia's banking sector from international markets. Nearly 1,000 international companies have left the country. The production of cars fell by 75% compared to last year. Aeroflot is grounding planes because there are no more spare parts. The Russian military is taking chips from dishwashers and refrigerators to fix their military hardware because there are no semiconductors anymore. Russia's industry is in tatters.
The 2% we are now is absolutely not enough. When you look what Russia is producing now in 3 months, is what the whole of NATO is producing from Los Angeles up to Ankara.
So quite the change. And so I want your take on this, given how not only the Ukraine conflict has changed, but how Russia has changed through it, and of course, this developing multipolar world.
Well, of course, everything van der Leyen was saying was completely untrue, and I've even heard hardcore pro-Ukrainian commentators, analysts from the West say, no, Russia was not doing that. You don't take chips from dishwashers and put them into missiles. It doesn't even make sense. And so it wasn't even true when she said it. But at the time, many people didn't really seem to know that. So they were taking advantage of people's ignorance. The situation on the battlefield wasn't manifesting itself in such an obvious way to make it clear. But I just want to point something out. People say, well, Brian, you've been right about Ukraine all along. But if you look at the sources that I'm using entirely Western sources, often sources from the US, or some European government itself, from the Ukrainian government itself, from Western analysts who are definitely unswervingly pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine. All along, the map that I show people in my updates is always a pro-Ukrainian map. I don't show any Russian or pro-Russian maps or sources, because I feel like if you're following those sources, you already more or less know what I'm going to tell. I'm trying to convince people that buy into Western propaganda. I'm trying to show how, even if you pay close attention, filter through the propaganda, even they, at the very beginning, were talking about deficiencies in Western military industrial output. The fact that Russia is actually producing a lot more equipment and ammunition than the narrative suggested, that outlook that van der Leyen was portraying. It was something that, even if you look through the Western media at that time, they were contradicting with actual facts, or the closest thing you can find that was a fact. And now what they're doing is they have to admit it, because you can't keep talking like van der Leyen when entire cities are falling to Russian forces. The Ukrainians are talking about opening investigations into entire brigades that unraveled and deserted. You can't keep talking about Russia collapsing when the only thing that we can see is Ukraine collapsing. So it's more perception management. They've tried to hold it off for as long as possible, admitting what is really going on in Ukraine. There's no way to cover it up or spin it. And you can see online, if you enjoy suffering and you go on X and you look at the hardcore pro-Ukrainian spheres of information on X, there are diehards who are still every day, Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing, Russia isn't able to do anything. Every tank they put on the battlefield, Ukraine is eliminating. They show all these videos and everything. But even their followers are starting to question them and say, you know, we're just kind of tired of pretending that Ukraine is winning. They're obviously not winning. So that's where we are right now. You're right, Danny. It's a huge transformation in terms of narrative. But I think the collective West knew this all along. I don't know. It's always hard to tell. The people actually making decisions, not the politicians selling it to the public. Do they really believe this? Is it that there are people in the West saying the truth, but actual decision makers are ignoring it? I tend to believe they do understand it. And again, their goal was never to help Ukraine. It was just to keep this going for as long as possible, raise the cost as high as possible for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Josh Rogan was saying in the Washington Post op-ed, this resident neocon. He was saying that it's a trap to get into negotiations with Russia because that helps Russia recover, and Russia's doing so poorly. We need to up the aggression. But really what they're saying is that Russia needs to continue to fight this war. We need to continue to supply it because that is what we want to do. We want to destroy Russia. But the interesting thing, though, Brian, that I wanted to get your take on is back in December 2024, the very end, there was an op-ed in The Hill, and it was from a diplomat who said that he was a U.S. so-called U.S. diplomat. He said that he was in think tank at a think tank conference. He didn't name which one it was, but there were senior Ukrainian officials and senior U.S. officials, and they were talking about how in April of 2024, Ukraine's military was in such a dire situation that it was probably best that they stopped fighting. And what ended up happening was that they went on fighting anyway, which seems to me to indicate exactly what you said, that they know this, but they're selling something different.
Yes, absolutely. I really do think that that's what's going on. And again, I hate to just keep bringing it up over and over again, but the Rand Corporation put out that 2019 paper titled Extending Russia, and they explained it in excruciating detail. As a matter of fact, every aspect of U.S. foreign policy is spelled out in excruciating detail in these think tank policy papers years in advance. If you just read them, you will know absolutely everything that is going to happen when it begins unfolding a year, 2 years, even sometimes 5 to 10 years afterwards, depending on the timeline. A lot of people say that the collective West doesn't plan beyond four-year political office terms, but that's not true. The think tanks do. That is who's actually running policy, and they think in years, 5 years, 10 years, 20-year blocks. That's how they do it, and many times they're successful in what they're doing. Look at Syria. That was not a failure. They eventually succeeded in hollowing it out, destroying it, and removing it from the region so that they could further isolate Iran. That was the whole point of it. They wrote about that in policy papers years and years and years ago. They did the exact same thing for Iran. They did the exact same thing for Russia. They've also done it for China. So they know this. They cannot come out and tell the public that this is what we're going to do. We're going to take Ukraine. We're going to ram it into Russia at the cost of their collective future. They have no future. We are going to feed Ukraine feet first into the meat grinder of proxy war. And if we do it right, there will be no Ukraine left, and Russia will be severely overextended. And we can then continue finding new proxies and new ways to pressure Russia until it collapses. They can't come out and say that. They have to frame it as if Russia started it, Ukraine is defending, and there's some sort of chance of them succeeding, or else people won't go for it. Unfortunately, people don't apply critical thinking. They don't do analysis. They don't even oftentimes listen to people who are offering it for free. You know, unlike the Washington Post, we don't put anything behind a paywall. I mean, I do. A lot of people don't. And you can get this information. I will show you the policy papers. People are not interested. Emotional narratives, unfortunately, always sell much better than cold hard analysis. People don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear bleak news and information, especially if it requires personal sacrifice and investment from them to change it. They want to believe that they can just go and vote once every 4 years and somehow change everything. It's just not true. And so this is why it continues. Even though they have the whole plan out in the open, like these policy papers are free on the internet to download. Anyone can read them, but people don't. And I understand why. There's like 100 pages long. It's dry academic English. It's extremely boring. You have to have kind of a basis of understanding just to know what they're talking about.
You have to find them too, right? Like you are doing meticulous research. They're not often promoted, that although their spokespeople are promoted. So if you're looking up who is talking in the Western mainstream media, you might find CSIS and Rand Corporation folks, but they might not be talking about their reports. But continue.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I guess yes, this is why we have people like van der Leyen saying these narratives, knowing that it's not true. They're not dumb. They know it's not. Well, maybe she thinks it's true, but the people telling her what to say, they know it's not true, because these are the people I got all the information from to confirm my analysis in the first place. So yes, that's the unfortunate reality. That they're not trying to save Ukraine. And when we're talking about peace for Ukraine or just with Russia, that it's just not in the cards. It's not part of the plan. So there's no one that's going to genuinely pursue that. Certainly not incoming President Trump. He's not going to pursue that. The people he's surrounded himself with are people who have been on board with this agenda throughout their entire political career. There's no way they're going to be. This is all theater. It's all about public perception management.
I wanted to, as you were speaking, it made me think about, Russia's particular strategy, not just in Ukraine, but generally, because we often hear like the DPRK, for example, developing a nuclear bomb, developing a hardcore military because of what they witnessed in Iraq, because of what they witnessed in Libya, because, and you could also throw Syria in there. It seems to me that Russia is attempting to glean similar lessons, maybe in a more favorable position. They saw what happened to Libya. They saw what happened to Syria. And of course, the end game happening maybe far longer than what the US and NATO wanted, but happening nonetheless. And it seems to me that that video that comparing van der Leyen and Mark Rutte, what it really demonstrates is how Russia has been preparing for this for a very long time. So now they not only have the most nuclear weapons in the world, they also have the Oreshnik, which might outmode nuclear weapons if used correctly in a certain kind of way. And they've also fought the Ukraine war in a particular kind of way to protect themselves, so that, as you were talking, Brian, earlier, there's so many other peripheries, so many other arenas. Russia has to be able to be vigilant against those if it's going to survive and live. So that was what I was thinking about as you were talking. What do you make of this kind of a strategy, maybe a bigger strategy of Vladimir Putin's leadership? And I think we have to actually credit a lot of this, not just to him, but the leadership of him and those around him in moving in this kind of direction.
Yeah, it's big. It's a big picture foreign policy. So every time Russia does something in Ukraine, it has to think of how it's going to impact absolutely everything else that it's doing, everything else that's in the middle of. So a lot of people emotionally, and again, it's understandable. A lot of people followed the conflict in Syria since it began in 2011. Some people even before that, because it's not as if that's when the U.S. began targeting Syria. It's targeted Syria throughout its existence as a modern nation state. People were very upset that Russia wasn't able to defend Syria, wasn't able to do more to support Syria. You see a blame game going on between supporters of Syria, supporters of Russia, blaming the other for giving up or cutting some kind of secret deal. And in reality, it was just that Russia is spread thin, plain and simple. They are heavily invested in Ukraine, and they do not have the additional resources to fight a conflict on that scale in Syria, as well as everything else you just mentioned, Danny, all of these other situations and potential threats along its periphery. We have to remember the U.S. tried to overthrow Belarus multiple occasions, including in recent years, and they're still trying, even to this day, right now. We saw the political chaos in Georgia. We have to remember in 2003, the U.S. did successfully overthrow the government in Georgia. They put a pro-U.S., pro-NATO client regime into power, they began militarizing the country into a battering ram against Russia. And in 2008, according to an EU investigation, Georgia struck at Russian peacekeepers, first precipitating the 2008 war. And Russia, like you say, Danny, they took not just lessons away from other nations being targeted and destroyed by the US and its proxies, they also took lessons away from what the US has done directly to them. Remember, the conflict in Chechnya was also one of these proxy wars the US was waging inside Russian borders for years and years and years, a devastating, actually 2 conflicts back to back. And so they understood the threat, a infiltrated, politically captured Ukraine being militarized, being NATOized, de facto NATOized, right on its border. They understood the very real threat, not just to national security, but their own self-preservation. They had to act, and they did act, and they have prioritized that higher than Syria. They're involved in Syria because they understand if Syria falls, it'll further isolate Iran. If Iran falls, this is going to further isolate Russia and, I would say, China in a much more global sense. So it's not as if they're not interested in Syria, but they've prioritized Ukraine first. This is how they think about foreign policy. They have to prioritize. They have to make hard decisions. They cannot be everywhere all the time. And so hard decisions have to be made. And they're thinking long term. So they're saying, Syria is lost today, but that's not permanent. When conditions are favorable, maybe we can do something about this in the future. It makes no sense to irrationally invest in a conflict you cannot win while you're already tied in basically a war with NATO in Ukraine right on your border.
Yeah, and I don't even believe it's a lack of, because I've heard people say Russia, China, Iran, they kind of lack almost like a solidarity, like a kinship, a desire to defend those who may be weaker and unable to. I don't actually see it that. I mean, there are so many examples of why that's just absolutely ridiculous when you consider what Russia's done for the people of the Donbass, what Iran has done for the resistance all across West Asia, what China's done in its economic terms to help poorer countries develop with fair trade deals. But I think it's about the fact that Russia knows, when you listen to Mark Rutte, when you listen to Ursula von der Leyen, they don't care if the board is destroyed. They are at the point where they believe the self-preservation of an empire and the riches that come from it could very well most possibly be secured by destroying the whole board, the chessboard, or Brzezinski's grand chessboard. No.
Yes.
Just wipe it all away. Like that is where NATO and the United States at its head is going. And I believe that's why there is this caution, there's this care, because it's not about, are we weaker than you? Can we not Oreshnik you? Can we not nuke you? No, you could. But then what happens thereafter?
No, that's very well put, Danny. Think about it like a game board, not to trivialize it, but it's a good analogy for people to visualize. It is a game board. It is a game. They're losing the game. From their point of view, flipping it over so that at least they don't lose. From their point of view, that is a better outcome than actually just outright losing. And like I said before, they feel like if they turn everything over, destroy everything, they feel like they'll be in a better position to rebuild and reassert themselves than the rest of the world that they're going to destroy. This is what China's dealing with its island province of Taiwan. They understand that the U.S. they're not defending the client regime on Taiwan. That client regime is a pile of dynamite with a fuse that they want to light and blow the whole island province up with. That's what that is, just like they've done in Ukraine. They understand that. And so they're doing everything in their power to avoid a conflict because they don't want Taiwan destroyed. They have no intention they don't want to destroy Taiwan. But the U.S. is going to do everything in its power to provoke a war. And if they can't provoke China into the war, they will start the war themselves. You watch. They will do it when they feel like they're totally out of time. They will go ahead and they will try to do that, just like they've done in the region, Syria, Iran, Yemen, even North Africa. also in Eastern Europe. And think about it too. I was so, again, I say this often, I was so sure before 2022 that Europe was going to pivot toward Russia, toward China. There were all the signs. They were literally building infrastructure together. Europe was talking to China about Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline was being built. It was so obvious that their interests were served by pivoting eastward away from the United States. And yet they went along with it anyway. Why is that? Again, it all comes back down to the political capture of these countries on the level of the government, but also the capture of these nations' information space by the U.S., by the interests that control the U.S., and their ability to convince people in these countries that working together with Russia and China somehow is not in their best interest. Going to war with them is sacrificing your economy, cheap energy, competitiveness in terms of industry. Giving all of that up is worth it to fight these evil Asiatic hordes to the east. They have convinced people of this, and you can see how it's leading them all off a cliff, and they're all in line going over the cliff.